Are you still on the rocks between Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5? You're probably thinking, which one is the better console? I'm gonna spend all my hard-earned money to for a next-gen console. I want to make sure I pick the right one. Well, you're in luck because this video we will have the PlayStation 5 versus the Xbox Series S in a comparison using Devil May Cry. They're gonna test, and this is by Digital Foundry. These are some expert people who know everything about this. This is going to be my reaction to it. I'll wait till the end of the video. I'll give you my own interpretation of what I just witnessed. And for everything new with gaming and funny reaction videos, consider subscribing, guys. Don't forget to hit that notification bell. Very important to stay updated with everything new with gaming and funny videos. Let's get started.
The first comparison of the new console generation is finally upon us, and it comes from an unlikely place. Yes, it's Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition on Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5. We have them both, they're feature parity, and the comparisons are interesting. And to discuss this momentous occasion, I am joined by the one and only Richard Ledbetter.
Hey John, I'm really excited by this because, not only is it the first multi-platform comparison of the next generation, it's on a state-of-the-art rendering engine, one that supports hardware-accelerated ray tracing, and a whole bunch of different features, and on top of that, a feature that you weren't too happy about with the PlayStation 5 version actually proves to be rather useful for this, right?
Yeah, that's right. So let's lay the groundwork. First of all, this version includes multiple modes. You have your standard 4K native mode. You have ray tracing modes, both in normal or high-res mode and performance mode, and then you have a 120 hertz mode. The Xbox version wasn't supposed to have ray tracing at launch, but here we are. It's there, it works, it looks great. But here's the thing. On PS5 specifically, where you can't change the refresh rate within the system UI, the game only outputs 120 hertz. And you can do the same on Xbox. There's no frame rate cap on any of these modes, which means we get to see every single mode run with a fully unleashed frame rate, which is actually perfect for comparisons.
Perfect.
I will say, visually,
it
is pretty much identical as far as I can tell. It seems to be all the same resolutions that we mentioned in the first video. It looks fantastic on both platforms. We're here to talk strictly about the frame rate because I think it reveals some curious things about the state of launch. So Rich, where should we begin?
Well, I think we should start just on the 4K native mode, but let's just confirm, just for sure, that everything we're seeing here is essentially like for like between the two platforms, because if we go back to the last generation, RE Engine, there are different forms of reconstruction, and we saw Xbox One X running at the same effective resolution as the PS4 Pro, even though the actual setup was very different. So can you confirm that this is actually like for like that we're seeing here?
Using system level screenshots, because I can't capture this at 120, it appears to be identical. So
right, okay, got it.
To the best of my knowledge, it seems to be the same. And yeah, it is a little bit difficult because we can't capture this game at the full resolution in 120 hertz mode because those devices are not HDMI 2.1, so I have to rely on these shots, and that's what it looks like. So
yeah, and I think we should confirm that the system will be downscaling the 4K 120 output to 1080p for the capture device here. So yes, I would not expect that to have any impact on performance whatsoever. So yeah, let's get on with it. Let's kick off with, the normal mode, native 4K rendering on both systems. I'm excited to see what you've got here.
Well, this is interesting then. It actually starts off, they're actually rather comparable, I'd say, but Xbox has a slight advantage. So I ran through this. I used a couple areas for this test, and I think this one in the city here is actually one of the best, just because it looks great and it's heavier than a lot of the stuff later on. And as far as you can see here, I mean, it's really close, but yeah, Xbox does have a slight advantage, no doubt due to some extra GPU grunt, perhaps. It's hard to say exactly what's going on there, but I mean, I'd imagine that's what's going on. What do you think?
I think it's a really interesting result because I think it kind of defies expectations. If you look at the spec sheets for the two machines, obviously we've got a more highly clocked GPU on PlayStation 5, but obviously Xbox Series X has much higher levels of memory bandwidth. It has more compute units. So you would expect something, a wider gap between the two. But at the same time, there's so much more to the makeup of a console than just the hardware specification. That's kind of one of the reasons why I haven't done a straight Series X versus PS5 spec comparison video, because, obviously we've been hearing some interesting things from developers about how these systems are performing, and fundamentally the litmus test, the only test that really matters, is the games. And here we are. It's the first game.
There we go.
Interesting result, but as we shall see, there's some interesting stuff still to come.
Okay, so thus far we've established Series X has a slight advantage, right?
Yeah.
But when we jump over to the high frame rate mode,
4K,
things
1080p
flip a
capture.
little bit. So at first you might think, okay, the cutscenes are similar to what we just saw. Slight advantage on Xbox. And it seems in this mode they're using some sort of reconstruction from what we can tell. But then you actually get into the gameplay. And suddenly, PlayStation 5 takes pole position.
Ooh.
And I'm this is really interesting then. So they actually kind of trade blows at different points. Like there's this scene here which is actually a little bit faster on the Xbox, but these other scenes all seem to run noticeably better on PS5 overall.
That's a big jump,
especially this one here. Like when you
I'm
get into this area, the frame rate drops really hard on the Xbox for some reason. Nowhere near as hard on the PS5. I mean, what do you think's going on here, Rich?
Yeah, interesting data again, and we can only really sort of offer up conjecture at this point, but the dips look really strange to me, and it kind of suggests to me possibly some kind of API limitation on the Xbox side, where the GPU is being held back by something. Now, I don't think it's the CPU. And if it's not the CPU and it's not the GPU, where do you go from there? It's not memory bandwidth. So it does suggest something at the system level, something at the API level. But yeah, fascinating results here, because we've gone from a slight Xbox advantage, where I'd say that PlayStation 5 was punching above its weight, to here, where actually I think we ran the numbers in terms of overall averages across the whole clip. And they were essentially like for like, but you can see that when the Xbox is dipping hard, it dips harder, and it seems to have an advantage in more select areas and in cutscenes, whereas in gameplay, which is the kind of more crucial part of the equation, it is the PlayStation 5 that has the advantage. So yeah, it's just fascinating to see the whole situation kind of flipping almost from what we saw in the first test.
Yeah, precisely. And I can also report I tested this with VRR, variable refresh rate, on the Xbox version, which is supported, of course. And unfortunately, I mean, the jump in frame rate is so significant that even VRR can't fully save this. Mm-hmm. It still feels like it kind of goes up and down in a way that's rather noticeable.
Yeah, and I've got to say, VRR on Xbox, it really is a killer feature. And I said in the PlayStation 5 hardware review that it's sorely missed on the Sony platform. And man, it would certainly help here, because the frame rate is more consistent, well above 60. It would certainly smooth out the experience. You certainly do feel the judder at 120 in this mode, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And that's, I said that in the original video as well. It's, even though the frame rate is pretty high and it looks good on paper, you still feel the judder. So neither version is really as smooth as I would have wanted in the high frame rate mode, I have to admit. So I'm a little disappointed there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
No. Now it's time for ray tracing. And okay, so let's start with the one that I think Capcom recommends, which is the ray tracing performance mode.
Okay.
And based on what I can see here, essentially we are looking at kind of similar to the regular mode, and this actually shows a slight advantage in the favor of Xbox. And you'll notice that in this first battle, the frame rate is generally over 60 FPS, which is pretty cool. But this is the 1080p mode, it should be noted. The resolution is dropped significantly. There's parts where the PS5 has some slight advantages, but overall I'd say, it's more like they're just really comparable.
Yeah.
I guess to me it's like, yes, you do have a slight advantage on Xbox, but it shows that the actual RT performance in performance mode when the resolution is dropped is extremely similar.
Yeah, definitely.
But then we have the RT quality mode, which is a little bit different. That one is actually more. That's basically where you get the same high resolution, I guess, that you would have seen in the 120 mode, but it runs with ray tracing enabled, which is obviously going to be pretty darn demanding. And so for that test, kind of like I just did for that RT performance, I also actually have this clip where I use the game's introduction sequence, which is a really heavy but beautiful cutscene. And if you look at the frame time graph, it's fascinating. And actually the frame rate graph, you can see that they follow each other like almost perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Like the drops all occur in exactly the same spots.
Yeah.
With Xbox having a slight advantage. And it's really curious and kind of interesting to see how that plays out in the sense. I mean, what do you think about this?
I don't really have any technical explanation for it, except, obviously the sense that you're getting here is that PlayStation 5, spec-wise, is punching above its weight, and something's up with Xbox, which, on paper at least, should be significantly ahead. But, we've been hearing this from developers for some months now, that, when they develop with PlayStation 5, they're instantly getting to grips with it. It's an evolution of what they've used already on PlayStation 4. That's paying off for them big time. And with Xbox, they've had to move on to a new system. And, a lot of people aren't so happy with change. And, it takes time to adapt. So, and, there may well be inefficiencies in the software stack. So, yeah, we just don't really know at the moment. But I think the bottom line is that, well, the experiences are sort of broadly comparable, and that kind of makes me happy in a way.
Yeah, I mean, they each have advantages in certain areas. Obviously, PS5 is running generally faster in the 120 mode, while Xbox has some advantages in some of the other modes. So they're really close. So it suggests that we're in for a very competitive generation, if you will. So it is kind of a first interesting step. And of course, being that this is a launch game, it is important to recognize that all these APIs, it's all still very early on the dev side. This is the first project from a lot of these teams, and it's launch, so it's kind of, I'd say, a preview of what's to come. But I think we'll continue to see improvements in all aspects. And I guess it's also worth quickly mentioning that this game has very fast loading times on both consoles, but that's one area where the PS5 version, again, is slightly faster.
Right, okay, because again, this is kind of flipping the tables a bit, where the on-paper spec advantage of the PlayStation 5, it's like a 2-to-1 advantage over the Xbox Series X. But the real-life advantage, in this title at least, it only translates to, a couple of extra seconds on the Xbox side. It's hardly a sort of deal breaker, really, is it?
That's exactly right. So both load very, very quickly now. And yeah, I mean, what we're saying here today, this is all just preliminary stuff, and it's just kind of fun to look at and discuss. There's so much we still need to learn about these consoles and how they're going to run in the long term. So nobody walk away from this taking any sort of judgment onto where these consoles fall yet, I'd say. This is just, it's a fun thing to look at.
Yeah, well, it's essentially the first set of data we've got to look at. And there are many, many more titles to come. And obviously, the way things might shift across the console generation, across the first launch window titles, we just don't know. But this is the first title, and it shows both Microsoft and Sony platforms having small advantages, each of their own, which I think is a really interesting state of affairs.
Yeah, I will say, though, it is worth pointing out that the one advantage of the Xbox version is that you can set your display to 60 hertz, which you can't do with the PS5 version currently. And the reason you want to do that is because every other mode, you don't really want them to be uncapped to 120, because then it's just too variable. And also, if you're on a non 2.1 display that supports 120 hertz at 1080p or 1440, you'd be stuck with a lower resolution image on the PS5, whereas on Xbox you can just drop it to 60 hertz and everything's just fine. So that's kind of separate from the game itself, but it shows the difference in approach to how resolutions are handled on both consoles. So yeah, curious stuff.
Yeah, this is really interesting because we're talking here in benchmark terms when perhaps the focus should be on the experience. And let's say I've got an LG B8 screen, or the C8 like you had. You had the C8, didn't you?
Yeah, that was my previous one before the CX.
Yeah, so, you know, if you have your Xbox Series X, you can set the console to 60 Hz and you'll get 4K 60, right? Whereas if you plugged in your PlayStation 5, you'll be getting downscaled resolution to 1080p and you're locked to 120 Hz. Now, I've been sort of swapping emails with Capcom trying to explain why this really isn't a good idea, and how you should have the option to switch between refresh rates. You know, hopefully that will be sorted out. But actually it is kind of jarring on PlayStation at the moment, and even if you do have an HDMI 2.1 display, you're still locked to 120 Hz. You can't lock to 60.
Really?
You can't lock to 60 Hz, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's a problem. It needs to be sorted. And I really do hope this isn't a system level issue with PS5. I hope it's unique to this title and will be patched and sorted.
Yes, and we will keep an eye on that. But yeah, for now, I think that's pretty much it. You know, it's our first look at these consoles running the same game. There's obviously going to be a whole lot more coming. And it was kind of fun to look at this, I think. And the results are, well, you have to let us know what you guys think, because I'm curious to hear the general thoughts on this. But
So it doesn't seem like there's a lot of differences. As they said before, they are the experts, and I do trust Digital Foundry on this kind of information. It doesn't seem like either or with these systems have a humongous advantage. But I guess this is still in the early stage, and I'm kind of curious to see where this goes. Anyway, guys, what do you think? Do you think that are you going to be buying an Xbox Series X, or will it be PlayStation? It's definitely Sony for me. Please let me know in the comments below anything that you think about this topic. Who do you think is going to be the better console, or if it's pretty much the same, what console will you be paying your hard-earned cash into? Guys, let me know in the comments below. As always, my name is Will. Don't forget, guys, where there's a will, there's a way. Stay golden, my friends.